Hello, welcome to Religious Studies AQA GCSE Series 3, Theme C, Episode 1, The Design Argument. Today we are starting a new topic from Paper 2. This is Theme C, The Existence of God and Revelation. This topic is all about the arguments for and against God's existence. So today we're going to have a look at what the design argument is, and we're going to have a look at its strengths and its weaknesses. So we can see that today's learning outcomes. We're going to understand what the design argument is, explain the design argument referencing William Paley and using examples, and we're going to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of this argument. Now, some religious people have used philosophical or logical arguments, such as the design argument, which we are investigating today, but also the first cause argument and the argument from miracles to try to prove the existence of God. However, atheists have argued against these, and atheists have used arguments from evil and suffering and from science to argue against the existence of God. Some Christians and people of other religions have created arguments to try to prove God's existence, though not all religious people believe that these arguments can prove God. So it is important for us to understand the difference between what we know as proof and what we know as evidence. Proof is something which shows something to definitely exist or be true, whereas evidence is something which indicates that something is likely to be true, or it is something which supports a theory. So just because we might have evidence for something, it does not necessarily mean that it is proven. Okay, so there is a key difference between those two things. Make sure, as ever, that you note the keywords down. You can see the pen symbol in the top right corner. Whenever there is that symbol, then it means that I'd like you to make a note of what is on that slide. So make sure that you get those down. As ever, feel free to pause the video at any points where you need to note anything down. Again, feel free to rewind if you need to go over anything if you didn't quite catch it first time round. One of the arguments that religious people use to claim that God exists is called the design argument. When we are talking about design, we are talking about when things show evidence of being planned for a purpose. So this argument is based on the idea that the world appears to be created and designed. So this is taken as evidence that it must have a creator and designer, or God. It is also called the teleological argument. This comes from the Greek word for purpose, telos. In other words, the world appears to have been designed for a purpose. Okay, so I'd like you just to have a think for a moment. I'm going to put up some items, and So, as I said earlier, the teleological argument and the design argument, they are one and the same thing. Okay, and this argument came about because the philosopher William Paley used the idea of design to try to prove the existence of God. So he was looking to prove, remember, prove shows something to definitely be true. He looked at a watch and said, if something like this requires a designer, how much more would the universe need a designer? So let's see the stages of his arguments. So to design something takes intelligence and thought. The universe shows evidence of design. Therefore, a being with intelligence and thought must have designed it. Only God could have intelligence and thought enough to design the universe. Therefore, as the universe exists, God must exist. Easy, right? Okay, take a moment. You will need to get this argument down. So just make sure in your notes you have a summary of this argument. Okay, so feel free to pause, feel free to rewind at any point. We're now going to go into Paley's analogy. Okay, so I would like you in your books to copy out this paragraph, making sure that you put the correct words in the correct places. So at this point, you will need to pause in order to do that. And once you press play again, then we will go through the answers. Okay, so let's go through the answers for this then. So, the design argument, this was developed by William Paley in the 18th century. He argued that if you found a watch on the ground, having never seen one before, it would quickly show that someone had put it together. Just as a watch cannot exist by chance, neither could the universe. The universe is far more complicated. For example, the human eye is far more complex than any human inventions such as the telescope. These can only help the eye. The universe was therefore designed, and that designer was God. Okay, so check your answers. Make sure you make any corrections if you need to there. Again, feel free to pause the video in order to do this. And just whilst you're doing that, have a think. Are you convinced by this argument? Is this convincing? Does this make sense? Do you agree with it? We are now going to take a look at the evidence for and against the arguments. And so in turn, we're going to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of the design arguments. You will notice that there is a pen symbol in the top right corner. So I would like you to make notes of these in your books. It is up to you whether you set out the strengths and the weaknesses in a table as I have done. Completely your choice as to how you want to lay this out. So let's get going on the evidence for the arguments from design. The scientist Isaac Newton gave the example of a thumbprint as evidence for the design argument. He said thumbprints indicated that the world had been designed because they are unique, and there would be no natural reason for humans to all have different thumbprints. Therefore, he thought they must have been designed by God. We've already spoken about William Paley, but as well as his analogy and the way in which he sets out the design argument, he also said that we can see evidence for the design argument through the fact that the world contains organised parts. For example, there are weather cycles, and plants and animals grow and reproduce, and life continues. In addition, we can see from the world that there is a function or a purpose to the world because it allows life. Thirdly, if the analogy between the world and designed objects is good, it does make sense for there to be a designer, as designed objects cannot exist without a designer. So the design argument could be thought to be strong in this sense. Another strength of the design argument is that there are many things which have to be just so for life to exist on Earth. It might be possible that these things came about by chance, but many things do seem to have been organised by a designer so that the world can support life. The elements oxygen and carbon are necessary for human life, and if the temperature on Earth was slightly different, or the sea level was slightly higher, humans would be less likely to be able to survive. This is an example of a fine-tuning argument, because the world appears to be finely tuned, to have had lots of little things contribute towards an overall outcome. Finally, another strength of the design argument is that it points to a purpose for life on Earth, if humans were designed, and many humans like to feel that they have a purpose. And many Christians also support the design argument because of the fact that they can see evidence for it in the book of Genesis, in the Bible. You've got the example there. God saw everything he had made and it was good. Clear evidence of design. And also, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the teachings in the Bible support this idea of God as the designer. Atheists and others have argued against the design argument, though, and not all religious people think that it provides evidence for God's existence. One argument against this is that the world does not seem well designed. Earthquakes cause devastation, there is disease, and animals kill each other for food. A world which did not have natural disasters or disease or creatures which kill and eat each other would seem preferable to many. If there are flaws which a God would not design, this is evidence that the world was not designed. Many atheists believe a loving God would not allow suffering, and that if the world was designed for a purpose, suffering would not be part of that purpose. Therefore, they argue that there cannot be a designer God because there is suffering. We will deal with the argument of evil and suffering again later in the topic. You've already covered this through looking at Christian beliefs and teachings, but we will revise this as one of the arguments against God's existence later in this topic. Another objection to the design argument attacks the analogy between the world and designed objects, and therefore between humans and the supposed designer of the world. There are many differences between the world and a watch, and therefore there might be many differences between how the world came into being and human designers. There could always be alternative explanations. For example, a puddle of water on the ground outside could have been caused by the natural process of rain or by someone pouring water onto the ground. If you see rain clouds, you may assume it was rain, or if you see someone running off with a hose, you might assume not. In the same way, a world designer is one possibility, but natural processes are another. The widely accepted theory of evolution also provides an alternative way in which plants, animals, and humans could have come into being, and suggests that they were not designed. Natural selection can explain why animals can camouflage, or why humans are intelligent, because useful genes which make species successful have been passed on to their offspring. In other words, humans and animals might not have been fine-tuned by an external being to fit into their environments. If plants, animals, and humans were not designed, then this casts doubt on whether anything else, such as the universe, was designed. And finally, some people also point out that even if the world was designed, this does not mean that there is one Christian God. There could be many designer gods. We simply do not know. So to finish off today's lesson, I have 2 questions that I would like you to answer. So based on what you've learnt about the design argument today and the strengths and weaknesses of this argument, do you think that the problems that we've just discussed make the design argument weaker? And then secondly, is this argument still as convincing to you before you explored its problems? So I asked you earlier whether you were convinced by this argument. Are you still as convinced as you were at that point, or has investigating the strengths and the weaknesses changed your mind? So I'd like you to explain your answer there. So feel free to pause the video. This is the end of today's lesson anyway. Make sure you complete that task and make sure that you've got all of your notes up to date from today's lesson. Thank you for taking part in this lesson. This has been Mrs. Loxton, AQA GCSE RE, Series 3, Theme C.